Everyone wants to protest, but you can't shirk the consequences. You have to be willing to own those too. And that turmoil helps create change.
Well, hello again, and welcome to In the Meanwhile. I'm Marcus Harrison Green.
And I'm Nora Kenworthy.
And Nora, how is the apocalypse treating you at this very moment in life?
It has been a wild week.
An understatement, some would say. An understatement.
Yeah, it's hard to even make sense of like how much changes in a week, I think. And as we've been prepping this episode in particular, it's felt like so much has been shifting of the ground beneath us.
Yeah, it was already sort of, I don't know how you were feeling like, but particularly being in the, journalism landscape. I mean, it was already sort of like just I don't know, a fire hose of hell and brimstone. And now it just seems like, I don't know what would be like in, a more extreme fire hose, I suppose. But like, that's kind of what we are at this moment.
Yes. Yeah, we've had, I think we started off with a whole Elon Musk, Donald Trump breakup, and now we're in the throes of a ton of resistance to immigration raids across the
Right.
country, and it's one of those weeks when it's hard to know when to put the news down
Yeah, as somebody,
and take a breath.
right. As somebody said to me, it's like the Elon and Trump thing was so 5 minutes ago, but it was literally 5 minutes ago. You know what I
It
mean?
was so 5 minutes ago. Yes.
As somebody said in that war between the two of them, you just got to root for the bullets, I guess. I don't know, but anyhow, that being said, um, I am really looking forward to an interview that we have for this particular episode, because one of the reasons that we started this podcast was the fact that we could sort of underscore and emphasize the actions of everyday people, because ultimately the main message is you don't have to be, some rock star civil servant or some politician or, some person who has a ton of money and influence and so on and so forth. You can just be you and create and affect a positive change in our society.
100%. Yeah. So, in our episode this week and probably in episodes to come, but especially this one, I think we're trying to give some honor and credit to everyday people who are standing up, who are practicing civic bravery, who are discovering it. And in particular, we're looking at what folks are doing around protecting immigrants from detention, protesting unlawful detention, deportation, and kidnapping. And I think we're also trying to do that as part of a broader conversation about what resistance and demonstration and activism looks like in this moment. I think you and I, Marcus, have both kind of observed and seen that things feel different than they felt in 2017 at the beginning of Trump's first term, when there was just tons of people out in the streets. Right? It felt much more visible.
Yeah, and I was actually surprised to learn that, well, I mean, maybe I should have been surprised just knowing how narratives can form and we can grab a hold of them, even whether they're true or not. But the fact is that, you had cited some information, some information stating that essentially, no, actually, there's been more protests out in the streets than there were even in 2016 during this time period. When Trump first took office, which I am a bit ashamed to admit I was actually surprised by.
Yeah, I think the media narrative, the storytelling around what resistance looks like right now is very different. But if you look at the actual numbers of where protests are happening, there's a group called the Crowd Counting Consortium at Harvard, which has shown that there are twice as many street protests between January and March of this year than during Trump's first term. So people are out there. These protests are a lot of times scrappier. They're more
Right.
targeted. They're more flexible. They're more long term. Like, look at what people have been doing in front of Tesla dealerships for months now. And we've seen results, which I
Yes.
also doesn't get told as part of the story, like, Tesla stock has, tanked. Elon's out of the White House. Thank you.
Yeah,
Uh,
I mean, for now, right? I mean, let's
For now, I know.
that's
He may come back at any
cautiously
time.
optimistic on that.
I'm gonna celebrate the moment.
You know, why not? Hell yeah, why not? That being said, too, this actually reminded me of the fact that when I was listening to an expert who studies authoritarianism and how you sort of beat it back in various countries, and they were talking about Poland, which okay, they did recently
Yes.
have an election that didn't quite go the way that folks maybe on the left are folks who even care about democracy wanted it to go. That being said, they have beat back at least, the worst, shall we say, impulses
Mhm.
of autocracy. And one of the things that one of the things that the expert was highlighting was the fact that during the time of a rising authoritarianism there, the media was still free to report about what was actually going on, right? They were still free to talk about some of the atrocities and just the attacks on civil liberties. And so I think right now, right, and like I know the media is getting beat down. There's, the funding of NPR and so on and so forth. But I
Mhm.
think, this really, as somebody who was a member of the media, I think this just sort of underscores how important it is to continue to get these stories out here about what is actually going on, the
Yeah.
folks who are actually doing the work, the fact that no, there is resistance. There, people aren't just complying, and there isn't just mass apathy. They're like people do care, and one of the things that is really heartening to me is that these protests aren't just happening in deeply blue districts and deeply blue communities and
Yeah.
deeply blue states. These are happening in fairly reliably red states, like
Yeah.
Jamie, who we're going to talk to today. Uh, her community is actually one of the most. I shouldn't say one of the most. It is the most reliably Republican voting district if going off of some data that NPR cited in their story about her. And yet and still, you had this mass rally for her students who were I'll just say abducted and kidnapped. um,
Mhm.
and and I think that is the important story to tell, is that ultimately humanity is humanity, right? And when people see humanity under threat, when they see their friends, their neighbors, their loved ones under threat, um, they're going to jump into action. And
Yeah.
I will say that I'm, again, cautiously optimistic, but I think this current administration is maybe overplaying its hand a bit in terms of thinking it was going to have carte blanche to do some of the horrific things that they want to do.
Mhm. And I think it's also equally important to recognize that, the environment for this type of action has become a lot more fraught and
Yes.
dangerous for people who are doing it, and so it is extraordinary that people are still mobilizing, people are still showing up in places where it's dangerous for them to show up, that people are
Yes.
continuing to warn neighbors when ICE is in the neighborhood, even when ICE looks like, an armed militia. Um, and so it's a much harder environment in which to mobilize. And so I think that makes it all the more powerful that people are continuing to do this work and show up for their neighbors, and really harnessing that community power.
Yeah. If you don't, I will say at this time period, if you are a member of an identity that isn't targeted, hint, hint, white, male, rich. You look, you just need to have your ass out here. Truly,
Yeah.
truly.
Yeah. And I think this also says something about, a topic that you and I have really been kind of returning to again and again, which is just the power of community, right? Part of the reason that there there is a mobilization right now is that neighbors are being kidnapped off the streets by masked
Yes.
people who refuse to identify themselves, who refuse to follow the rule of law. And you know who notices? It's their own communities, it's their own neighbors
Who
who notice, who see that happen, and through witnessing it, have the power to do something about it right in that moment.
right.
To not let this happen in the dark, right? Or to not let it become invisible. So,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the fear, right? The fear is the point. I was
mhm,
talking to you, off air about a friend of mine who lives down in LA, and he was talking about the fact that his mother, who was a U.S. citizen, been a U.S. citizen for, you know, over 4 decades now, is scared to leave her house because she
Yeah.
doesn't, English wasn't her first language. She doesn't, speak it as well as she would like. And so she's scared that she'll be rounded up just for the fact that she's brown skinned and predominantly speaks Spanish, right? And this is
Yep.
somebody, again, who's a US citizen who is quote unquote did all the right things and yet is scared to walk around in their own country. I mean, the
Yeah.
fact that that is in any way a scenario in this country should frighten everybody.
Yeah, I mean, this entire last 6 months, I've had students in my classes who are afraid to come to class, be even though they're not undocumented, or who are unable to come to class because they're helping family members run basic errands, and I think so much of that has kind of flown under the radar of what people are aware of, as the kind of lived experience of the moment for
Right.
so many people. And so to echo your call, Marcus, I think it's time for all of us who don't feel fear
Right.
for ourselves and family members when we leave the house to like leave the house, get out there.
Exactly.
um, yeah, and put ourselves at the front.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. I'm hopeful that more people will. And I think, honestly, after this conversation, they just might. So. We're joined by two guests today to help us make sense of all this chaos that goes beyond hot takes and conjecture and into understanding. We're joined by Professor Angelina Godoy, an award-winning human rights scholar, sociologist, and founding director of the University of Washington Center for Human Rights. A former Amnesty International staffer, her work focuses on Latin America, where she explores the intersection of justice, violence, and public health. She holds the Helen H. Jackson Endowed Chair in Human Rights and teaches in both law, societies, and justice, and the Jackson School of International Studies. Thank you so much for being with us today, Angelina.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
So I want to start off just with this time period we're finding ourselves in with, Marines being deployed to cities. We have a president who is saying that they're any type of protest at his military/birthday parade will be met with extreme force. So I want to start off by asking you, as someone who spent much of your career documenting state violence in Latin America, what was your initial reaction when you saw reports of the federal government deploying National Guard and Marines to confront protesters in California? And, what does that signal to you about the current state of human rights here in this country?
My reaction was concern and dismay because I think that escalating the violence serves no one's interests. And I'm worried about real harm to real people. And I'm also worried about just, spending millions of dollars unnecessarily at a time when people need food and housing, and there's many other better ways to spend that money. Um, but I also will say that my sense of alarm, as I think yours as well, probably predated a lot the decision to send in the National Guard or the Marines. And it's the conditions that people were protesting or are protesting that to me are the real news story here, or the real thing that we need to be focused on rather than the skirmish in the streets itself. Not to say that
Mhm.
people protesting is not important and people having that right respected is not important. Those things are important, but what's really important from a human rights point of view is the conditions that are happening every day. That is what's leading people to take to the streets, even at risk to the
Sure.
life and limb at this point. Um, that's where my alarm comes from.
I mean, this administration isn't the first, obviously, to use sort of Orwellian language to rationalize some of its actions. And so I want to ask you, I mean, with you studying how governments use the language of security in order to
Mhm.
justify crackdowns, from your perspective, how should the public understand, the official rationale for these troop deployments against largely peaceful protesters, especially when that rationale is framed around immigration enforcement or quote unquote protecting federal property?
I think that's just textbook authoritarianism. It's
Mm.
not creative, it's not new, and it's sort of like, okay,
Yeah.
move, if A then B, move on to the next one. That's what dictators across the world have said across history. That's the reason, the quote unquote reason that we are told we need to tolerate all kinds of mass violations of our rights, and not just us, but people before us, as I said, across history and across the globe. So this was very predictable, and here we are.
Mm.
Yeah, just to quickly follow up on that, I was talking the other day to Nick Brown, who's the Attorney General of Washington State, and um, he's a person who's extremely measured whenever he's communicating. He does not deal in hyperbole at all, and told me directly. He said the last 5 months of this administration, and particularly this, over these last couple of weeks with these troop deployments, he said, "This is how can you not say that this is anything but clear cut fascism?" And, I mean, I've quite frankly, I mean, I've thought that from day one. That being said, to have an elected official who, again, isn't somebody who makes it his business of sort of dropping, verbal bombs or so forth.
Yeah.
Um, what do you think that says about this time period, that things have gotten to the point where it's just impossible to deny what's actually going on? Or
Um, I think it's yeah, I guess that's what I think. I think it's useful to recognize where we are at. I think it's even more useful to start thinking about what we can do. And
Mhm.
um I don't know what the deployment of the word fascism means for Nick Brown, but I hope it means concrete actions, because there's things happening here in Washington state that demand immediate action to defend the rights of Washingtonians. And so talking about, what's happening at a national level, or talking about the politics, or talking about the optics of the National Guard rolling into LA is one thing, but there's
Mm,
actions we need to be doing now here at home.
Mhm.
yeah, I'm just curious, what are some of those in your opinion?
Well, one of them is in no particular order. These are just things come to mind. One of them is, I mentioned a few moments ago, accounts coming out of LA of people being detained in the federal building and held there for I'm not sure how many hours, and congressional representative trying to get in and being denied access. We've seen that same pattern elsewhere, and we've seen it here in Washington State as well. Of people being detained in extraordinary conditions without access to water, without access to attorneys, without access to the general public, and without even information about where they are, how they're being detained. That's happening here in Washington. I'm not sure that Washingtonians are grappling with that. There's a story, if
Mhm.
Mm,
if you'll permit me, I'll tell you a story of a case that I learned about recently that did make the news, and within 12 hours it was gone from the news. But so this is a story of a family of asylum seekers who were picked up by the Border Patrol. Their asylum case was not successful, and they decided to try to make it to Canada. And somewhere along that path, the Border Patrol picked them up. Six people. The mother of the six, so it's a parent, two parents, and four children. The mother of the six is pregnant in a high risk pregnancy. The youngest of the six is an 11-month-old baby. The other kids are school age kids. This family was held in a Border Patrol holding station in Blaine, Washington for over 3 weeks. Now, I'm
Oh
wow.
not
my
talking
god.
about a family being held in a family detention center, which would be concern. I'm not talking about a family being held in a motel, as sometimes folks have been put in DHS has held families in motels, and that's a concern. I'm talking about a family being held in one room without windows, with fewer beds than people, and denied any access to attorneys, denied access or ability to make calls. Um, those school age kids denied access to any kind of stimulation, books, I don't know, toys, whatever,
Right.
um, for over 3 weeks. When I and other human rights advocates learned that this family was being held under those conditions, at first I thought, well, this can't be true. It has to be some sort of a rumor, but there might be some kernel of truth in it, and we've got to figure that out. We've got to at least, take seriously the fact that they may be being held. And so I and others started calling the Border Patrol and asking, do you have this family in custody? Where do you have them in custody? And they denied any access to information about that. Finally, congressional offices started calling and asking about that family. And the Border Patrol did indeed, at my understanding, give some information to those congressional offices. But the congressional offices, because of respect for privacy laws, so I'm not here criticizing those congressional offices, said, well, we can't share that information with you, Professor Godoy, because you're not neither a family member nor are you the attorney of this family. Now, the family did have an attorney. That attorney was unaware that they had even been detained. Um, and they have no other family other than those that were locked in the cell with them in this country. So there's nobody else that could be making those inquiries. Finally, enough inquiries were made that the Border Patrol decided to let them go, which just goes to show that the whole thing was discretionary anyway. So after weeks under those conditions, oh, I forgot to mention that they were only allowed out of that one room cell once a week, at which time they would drive them somewhere else to somewhere that they described as far away. I don't know where that was, to take a shower. And at that time,
Oh my
the
God.
father and eldest son were put in chains for those drives and showers. So this happened for over 3 weeks. And while people were sounding the alarm, the mechanisms we have weren't working in the sense, I mean, they eventually worked because the family was liberated. However, if you think about the trauma that those people are going to be with for the rest of their lives, I don't think you can say our systems are working. And if we don't have a system to recognize that our own federal government is capable of holding people incommunicado in a situation that under international law, that looks like a forced disappearance,
Hmm.
and therefore activating mechanisms whereby state folks can go in and inspect and make sure kids are being held safe. Kids are being held, make sure they're being held under safe conditions, or at least demand access to information so the family can call out, or somebody get to the bottom in real time of what's happening. If we don't have those systems, and this case shows we don't have those systems, then we can say it's fascism all we want, but the question is, what are we doing about it?
Hmm. I mean, that story also makes me think of like how many other families like that are we not hearing about,
Exactly,
right?
exactly.
And there's just so many families who don't have the call to the right person that like, ignites some amount of mobilization to call representatives to kind of shed some light on the situation. Do we have any sense of numbers here and how many of these cases are coming to light and how many aren't?
No, we'd have no sense. The family said that while they were detained, other people were being detained as well, including other families. Nobody knows who those people are. Nobody knows if they're still being detained. Nobody knows if new people are being picked up since then. And also, that particular family didn't have access to call out or anything. The
Oh
only
my God.
reason that people learned of that was because of essentially kind of community whistleblowers that saw what was happening and sounded the alarm, um, which is at risk to their own jobs, to be frank. So
Mm.
that's not going to happen in every case. I'm sure it's not happening
Mm,
in other cases. If we know that case happened and that's beyond dispute, that did happen. I was part of the team of folks working on it. That has to be a like DEFCON 5 moment for anybody concerned about human rights in this country
mhm,
and in this state. Um,
mhm.
that's where I'm really alarmed. So when I see community taking to the streets to defend their neighbors against a system that's doing that to pregnant women, babies, children, then I say, yeah, community should be taking to the streets. Thank God they're taking to the streets because our
Y
government is failing us. And I don't only mean our federal government, I also mean our state government. We have to do better by our own neighbors.
Yeah. Wow. So I'm thinking about all of your experience with groups like Amnesty International and also the work that you've done over decades in Latin America, where state and military forces, I mean, and it's important to note, state and military forces, often backed by our own government, have historically been used to silence dissent and criminalize marginalized communities. And um, can you draw for us some parallels between those types of histories? Do you see echoes in the patterns?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot, actually. The case I just shared with you is an example of one that sort of sounds those echoes really loud. It's hard not to draw a direct line because of the practice of enforced disappearance in particular. So that's not the only human rights concern that we see happening, but it is a human rights concern that elevates. So forced disappearance under international law involves, states taking custody of a person, either denying they have access, denying they have that person in their custody altogether, simply saying, we don't have them, or refusing to give information about their whereabouts and well-being such that they could defend themselves, such that an attorney could inquire to their whereabouts, such that they could, again, defend themselves. These are core due process mechanisms. When that happens systematically against civilians, that is considered a crime against humanity under international law. Do I think it's happening systematically now against civilians? I think it might be.
Yeah.
And I think what we don't have is the evidence of its systematicity. And the reason we don't have that evidence is because we've allowed our federal government to operate its mechanisms of immigration enforcement in total secrecy. So we don't
Mhm.
know where Border Patrol is holding people, and they don't have to tell us. We haven't compelled them. As a people, we have not compelled them to disclose that information. So, yeah, that counts as a forced disappearance. If it's happening systematically, it's a crime against humanity. These are the most serious, the most urgent, the most the highest level of concern that human beings across the planet should have if we believe in a concept of human rights. And so, if we know this is happening on our watch, we can learn from other places where it happens systematically. Latin America is a great example because the whole idea of forced disappearance, well, it was a practice that had occurred under other regimes in other times. It wasn't invented in Latin America.
Yeah.
It was activists from Latin America that called attention to the particular harms caused by holding people incommunicado, not only harms to those people, but also to their family members, and the extreme torture that it constitutes, right? So the struggle that people led against those practices under the dictatorial regimes of Latin America in the 1970s and 1980s should be instructive to us. It should also obligate us to wake up and say, okay, who in our community is profiting off of this? Who in our community is looking the other way while it happens? Who in our community has a legal and ethical and moral responsibility to take action because they are the Attorney General of the state of Washington, not to call him out as an individual, but I mean, we do have institutions that are in charge of upholding the welfare of our people. And those institutions can't operate business as usual. I think they're doing that still too much. They're doing that and offering us strong language. That's nice. It's not enough.
Mm,
Mm.
right. I was listening to President Trump talk to troops at Fort Bragg yesterday,
Mm.
and there he mentioned Gavin Newsom, the governor of California. He mentioned Karen Bass, the mayor of LA. I mean, he mentioned their names and how they were, quote unquote, I'm paraphrasing here, but, enabling, I guess, criminal activities and criminals to run, rampant over over California. Their names were actually jeered and booed, and it reminded me so much that so many atrocities throughout history, regardless of geography, regardless of where I should say they happened, have been because you have people who are quote unquote just following orders, right?
Mm.
And so I'm wondering, particularly in with your expertise and your studies in Latin America, I mean, how important is it for those who sort of serve the state, if you will, to have some level of epiphany that, okay, am I, by serving the state, quote unquote, am I actually doing more harm to our, um, our general community, if you will, as opposed to, if I don't follow orders and, and don't
Mm.
adhere, if you will, to this, to this potential despot, if you will.
Well, I mean, if your question is, should they know better or should they do better? Yeah, they should know better. They should do better. And history will judge them. Their own children will judge them. And I don't know. For some of them, I think their conscience will torment them till their final days. Others know there's people who are capable of committing horrific acts to other human beings and walk around feeling perfectly fine about it. I think that's lamentable. But I think we should devote our energies to figuring out how we protect each other, not what's wrong inside their heads, because it's clearly wrong.
Mm.
Gotcha.
So it seems to me that um, one of the key things you're pointing at in this conversation is that there's a really important role for communities and everyday people to play in drawing attention to what's happening, to essentially doing on the ground sort of raising and almost like reporting of what's
Mhm.
happening. And then also just like getting into the streets and being very clear that this is unacceptable and terrifying and an abuse of human rights. Am I getting you right there?
Yes. I
Okay.
agree with everything you just said.
What else? What else can we do?
Well, I mean, I think we need to protect our neighbors. I think the best way to protect our neighbors is by reporting what we see. I think those of us who have privilege, whether it's skin color privilege, citizenship privilege, other forms of privilege, this is the time to get out to get out from behind our screens and use that privilege. Because people's being lives are being altered in violent and terrible ways. And yeah, so community defense mechanisms,
Yeah.
rapid response to raids can be really helpful. Here in Seattle, I haven't had a chance myself to go to the immigration court, but what I've been hearing and seeing is that ICE, as in other parts of the country, are showing up, masking their face, not having
Yeah.
warrants, and grabbing people who are alone, awaiting
Yeah.
their immigration proceedings. So that's really important for lots of reasons. One thing it is important about it is it makes it a low bar for community involvement to protect our neighbors because they're snatching the people who are alone. There was an account
Yeah.
from last week that was, people took video of it and circulated on video. A person's attorney went to the bathroom, and while their
I
attorney
saw
was
that.
in the
Yeah.
bathroom, these masked men drag the woman who literally faints and then drag her physically, bodily into an elevator, right? So
Yeah.
that, when I see that, I'm like, oh my God, I could have been there, right? Maybe I should have canceled my
Yeah.
appointments that morning. That's a low bar for what we can do to help our neighbors. Like, those are people who are participating in a legal process. So for all those who
Yeah.
say, like, oh, this is criminality, or why don't people come the right, these are people who in many cases applied lawfully for asylum and now are going through with those proceedings, right?
They're
They
doing what they've been told to do. They're
they're
doing the legal
they're
thing. Yeah.
following all the rules. And when
Yeah.
those rules become an entrapment for them,
Mm.
that's a grave concern. If there's a way that you or I or others can be present and help avoid them falling into that system, I think we have a moral obligation to do that. So protest is important, but there's also things that aren't protest at all. That's just simply being present, being eyes and ears and a body
Mhm.
next to somebody who otherwise might be snatched by men wearing gaiters over their faces,
Yeah.
not presenting an arrest warrant, not presenting any documentation that they have done something wrong and therefore need to be arrested.
Yeah. Well, I want to ask you, and this question kind of hits close to home as I'm a journalist, but it seems like every single time that there are, with the growing protest movements that are, anti-ICE in nature, that are sort of sweeping across the country now, we're seeing a rising effort to discredit these protest movements as either violent or extreme, yeah, particularly through some media framing. And so I want to ask you, Angelina, what role does this kind of narrative manipulation play in paving the way for state violence, and what responsibilities do, you know, not to call us out here on the show, but what what responsibilities do academics, journalists, and activists have in countering it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really important because the characterization that the Trump administration is making of the protesters as violent mafias, or whatever they're saying, um, too often that first of all, that's patently false on its face, right? Because we know that the protests were not engaged in even property destruction on any major scale until the arrival of the National Guard. So that's an important thing. Like, who brought the violence? That's an important thing to keep in
Mhm.
mind. But secondly, I think sometimes we get dragged into those narratives because Trump said it, and then we're all debating whether it's true or not. Well, Trump
Yeah.
says lots of things that are like batshit crazy, like, and we don't get dragged into debating all of those because they're just so
Right.
crazy, right? So
Right.
Yeah.
so why are we debating some of these things? Is that a contribution to our collective discussion? I do think there should be discussion about protests. Why are people protesting? Under what conditions are they that's fair and legitimate and important in society where people can express themselves. But I think the discussion about the protests and about whether they're criminal and about that, and then all these people going into these discussions about, well, people shouldn't be wearing, waving the Mexican flag, or people shouldn't be doing it, like all this criticism of that. That's not the issue. The issue is that people are being held incommunicado in places that are unfit
Right.
for human habitation, and they're being held in some cases for extraordinary long periods of time. And I'm not only speaking of like the family that I was talking about in Blaine, Washington. Look at the conditions in our detention center here in Washington State. That detention
Yep.
center is, I believe, currently negotiating to extend its contract to 2040 because it runs out in September 2025. That seems to be pretty newsworthy, right? Like, have there been proposals for a new contract? Who's gonna is it going to be the same company continuing to administer that facility? Under what conditions? What are the conditions in the contract? Nobody knows. It's all secret. So that, I think, is like where we need to dig in as, media, but also as researchers, all of us, and say like, okay, let's step back from the noise that Trump drives because he wants to drive it because it serves him, and it's driven by hate and lies anyway. And let's actually look at the substance of what's affecting real people in our state, in our communities, and their basic ability to survive. And that's harder to
Y-
get to. That's a harder conversation to have because of the secrecy, and you need to find ways to penetrate the secrecy. You need to find ways to demand some transparency. It's kind of easy for people to be out there pontificating about like the protests or this or that, but I don't think it adds much.
Yeah, it's also so wild that we're holding protesters to this like standard of like you have to protest perfectly in order for us to take you seriously while facing off like incredible amounts of violence from police and National
Right.
Guard.
Mhm.
And yet we're not holding ICE agents or our own police or anyone else to even like basic standards of decency, right? So it's
Mhm.
this like incredible hypocrisy in terms of the standards that each group has to meet in order
Yeah,
to be taken seriously.
absolutely. I mean, did anybody face consequences for the family separations of 2018?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. How can people support your work who may want to after hearing this interview?
Well, I definitely would appreciate support for our work. And when I say our, I mean the UW Center for Human Rights, which I direct. But I think right now, what I think people should do is uh, go down to the immigration court and see if you have a few hours and you can spend them keeping somebody from the clutches of a violent and lawless state. I think that would be the more powerful way that people can support the work that needs to be done right now. Of course, if they want to send us a donation, I won't turn their check back. I believe in the work we do, but I also believe that all of us need right now to look beyond institutions that are doing the work and say, what can I do today with the few hours I have free this afternoon or whatever it might be, and do that thing.
Mm, thank you.
Awesome. No.
And for those who are intimidated by the idea of going to a courthouse alone, I just also want to say that there are lots of groups who are organizing this work and that will help people learn how to do this work and support them in doing it.
Yeah, or I would also just say, like, you can go to the detention center as well. La Resistencia is
Hmm.
holding, and other organizations as well, are holding regular gatherings outside those facility walls that are attended by hundreds of people. And that makes a difference. They usually have the chance to call in to people who are inside, and those folks inside can hear the chants
Hmm.
and yelling of people outside, and it makes them know they're not alone. I- That's really worthwhile.
Yeah. We'll put some links for folks in the show notes.
Absolutely. Uh, Thank you for helping us navigate this in the meanwhile.
Sure. Thank you.
Nora, I gotta say, this was an extraordinary conversation, truly. Like I've known Angelina for maybe about a year or so. I first came across her when I was doing a story about immigrant rights here in the state of Washington, and my goodness, as bad as things were back then, it was in comparison, it was like, I don't know, the Wizard of Oz or something in our
Yeah.
Disneyland in comparison to what's going on right now.
I mean, I have to say that it's almost refreshing to hear someone speak in such clear terms and with such clear language about what's happening right now. I feel like we've been talking around this issue. We've been using this almost more gentle language to describe what is a horrific and truly like history breaking set of circumstances for our country. And I think her narrative here helps us to understand the power of saying how things actually are. And I
Yeah,
think that's a power all of us hold.
absolutely. And I gotta say, that's like I want to underscore that, particularly in passive aggressive Seattle, where we are recording from, when
Yeah.
everybody talks around things all the time, to have somebody just be extremely direct and, to your point, just crystalline clear, when it comes to what are the moral implications of what's going on right now. Again, please support Angelina's work at the Center for Human Rights. Nor, I mean, you are an educator. This was not purposeful. I promise the listener, but we ended up having two educators on our show today. Both of them are obviously doing amazing work. I mean, you just heard from Angelina. We also have another educator who did some extraordinary work over here on the East Coast.
Yeah, and I think both of them are also pointing to the power of everyday people. So it's not just that they're educators, it's that they're educators who are willing to kind of step outside of their role and do the work of everyday activism, which I think is part of what's so inspiring about both of these conversations. Um, so it's a huge pleasure to introduce our second guest today, Jamie Cook, who is principal of Sackett's Harbor Central School in upstate New York. And as someone who has a lot of family in upstate New York, I will say that your story, Jamie, really resonated with me in a very deep way and kind of spoke to the ways that I've experienced that community and those communities in upstate New York. So, Jamie Cook, along with Jen Gaffney and Jonna St. Croix, were recently given a Civic Bravery Award by the Courage Project for leading their small New York town in support of a local immigrant family that was unlawfully detained by ICE, organizing a public rally, and a series of actions that ultimately helped bring the children and the family home. Um, it's so great to have you on the podcast, Jamie. We want to just kind of give you space to tell your story. So, do you want to tell us a little bit about how you got into education? Like, how did you become a principal?
Oh, goodness. Well, I always wanted to be a force for good. I knew I wanted to feel morally driven. I knew I wanted to make the world a better place. But I was also desperately poor. So first I went to law school, started out there because that just seemed like the quintessential program for changing the world and making more money. And within the first 3 days of law school, I could just feel in my bones that I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And by the time a young person is in the court systems, so much has already gone wrong. There are so many
Mm,
layers that you can't unpack.
Double.
And I just felt in my body that I was meant to be a cog that was sooner in the system and to really, work with kids before they got to that point. And so I left law school right at the end of my first year for a master's in teaching and got my boots on the ground in public schools. My family thought I was insane. Um, and I've loved every single moment of it. And something that really helped me make the jump from law school to public school teaching was that there was a group of law students and lawyers who were volunteering at Auburn Correctional Facility, which is a
mm,
maximum security prison. And they were tutoring inmates in GED prep and realizing there were young people in there with life sentences who we were helping read.
Mm.
mhm,
Um, and so that was something, I went back to my dorm with night after night and just really reckoned with
hmm,
about, how can I be a part of this half of the system and not call attention to the what came first.
hmm,
So law school I walked away from, and education really became a lifeboat for me. Teaching became a lifeboat for me. It pulled me out of poverty, gave me security like I'd never had in my entire life.
hmm.
And I feel like I can throw that lifeline back in, and not in big ways like what happened this year, but usually just, by seeing kids for who they are and loving them and calling them to be their best selves.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a pleasure to meet you, Jamie. And I gotta say, your story very much resonates with me. I originally started in the finance world, working for hedge funds and so forth, and kind of, I guess, just fell out of love with that whole notion of everything being a commodity, and making as much money as you can. And I went into the lucrative world of journalism, and which finds me here today. That being said, can you tell us a little bit more about the town of Sackett's Harbor and just what is the vibe there, and what made you return as opposed to go off into LA or New York or a bigger city, like
Yeah.
yeah, why come back and give back to your community?
Sackett's Harbor, when you go there, you feel like you've traveled back in time. So it really is kind of a Mayberry neighborhood. It's a community of neighbors. People all know their neighbors. Children still, walk to school. They walk along Main Street as a really vibrant Main Street. And it's truly a village. It's a village of 1,300 people.
Hmm.
Cool.
They have active town hall meetings. They have active community groups. So there was so much in place that when this happened in Sackett's Harbor, it was these ties in the community, these ties between neighbors that were already positioned to help.
Mm.
Everybody knows everybody's business. And in this instance, that was a blessing.
So, for those who aren't familiar with this story, can you just kind of walk us through what happens?
Well, on March 27th, ICE went to a local house with sheriffs from a local county, with local police enforcement. They went there with a warrant for one man. They very quickly detained that one individual, and then they broke down the door of the neighboring house and took 3 of our students and their mother. And that morning, it happened early in the morning before 7 a.m. It was our 3rd grader, a 10th grader, and 11th grader. And our 11th grader had been studying for the Regents exams.
Yeah.
Not all states have those, but in New York State, we have exit exams for every subject, and they're a big deal. And so
They get you scholarships to college and stuff,
yeah,
right?
in New York,
Yeah.
they're like the gold standard. You have
Yep.
to pass them. Kids stress about them a lot. And she had been prepping for her Regents exam. And so in our small, tight-knit community, a teacher had been picking her up before school, bringing her in, and helping her with Regents prep. And so that teacher showed up there that morning to the swarm of vehicles. She called me. I took that call. I could barely make out the words she was trying to say. The phrase she said was, ICE took them, ICE took the kids. And I just had like a full body gasp. Like I feel that gasp because it was just incomprehensible. And at first it was just shock. We put counselors in place at school. Teachers were kind of like in the hallways whispering. Because we're such a small community, we have many other children who live on that same street, many other buses that drive by. So very quickly, word traveled. But what was amazing was that within an hour, maybe 2, teachers changed the questions that they were asking. And instead of just comforting each other, they were asking, what can I do? What do we do? And within hours, they had mobilized, and those groups in the community of neighbors had mobilized. And between classes, during their lunch breaks, and the hours after school, multiple community organizations, the teachers union, they all started making phone calls to every level of government, advocating for our kids and asking that they be returned to their classroom. So it very quickly, within a matter of hours, we had hundreds of calls going out, local, regional, state, federal representatives. It got to the point that representatives started calling us back and saying that we had to stop because we were overwhelming their offices.
That's when you know you're doing a good job.
Yes.
And I mean, it was whiplash of feeling so hopeless and so small to feeling like, okay, maybe somebody's going to hear us. And so, a couple reps told us, hold tight, we're going to help you, but you back off a little bit so that we can handle this. And Friday we backed off. Saturday we waited. And Sunday the youngest child's teacher, classroom teacher, had been scouring the internet all weekend trying to find the kids through the ICE databases. And so it was the classroom teacher that found the students and found that they had been transferred for deportation and were in Texas.
Oh my God.
And so at that point, we were not waiting, we were not easing up. And all of the effort that we had put in that first day, it was like tenfold. And so for the next week, everyone advocated to any politician, any advocate, any representative who would listen. And the community organized a rally. And so they said the rally would be Saturday. The kids were originally taken on Thursday. Sunday, we realized they were in Texas. And then that whole week, the organizers said if the kids could be returned, they would call off the rally. And this was especially controversial because Tom Homan, Donald Trump's border czar, has a home in our community. He went to high school 20 minutes away. I worked for the newspaper when I was like 20 years old. I've interviewed Tom Homan. Like, he is a fixture of our community. And so people felt really betrayed. And so the dialogue that was happening in our community just had a richness to it that I don't think would have happened anywhere else in America. And so the rally planned to march to Tom Homan's house as a sign of disapproval that, you know, the school that's just 2 blocks away from his house, that we had lost a 3rd grader, a 10th grader, and an 11th grader. And so the night before the rally, I was still hopeful that our kids would be returned. And I would say it was probably around 6 or 7 o'clock when I realized, like, no one's coming. And the rally's going to happen, because I think we were all hoping that the rally wasn't going to happen. Online, the discourse had been really tense, aggressive. The number of people who said that they were coming as counter protesters was really high.
Did
and
you
s-
have a sense of whether those people who are talking about counter protesting, were they from the community or from outside?
I think it's a mixture. And at that point, we didn't know.
Mm-hmm.
At that point, we didn't know. So that was when I decided to write my letter. And when I wrote that letter, I wrote an open letter about, you know, basically begging for the release of our children. And I didn't know who I was going to send that to. It was just like, I have to write one more email. Like, there has to be one more person I can send it to. And so that night, I sent it to all of my representatives again. And then in the morning, when still nothing had happened, I just posted it on Facebook, kind of like with a last-ditch effort.
And it ended up going, pretty viral. Is it possible for our listeners that who aren't maybe familiar with your letter, that you could read a little bit from it?
The fact that our students were handcuffed and put into the same van as the alleged criminal from down the street is unconscionable. When I think of my 3rd graders' experience, my stomach twists and it is hard to breathe. We are in shock, and it is that shared shock that has unified our community in the call for our students' release. Please think about how long every hour feels for a 3rd grader in a detention center. The wait had already been too long a week ago. I have no other agenda. Please release my students and their mother back to our community. And, you know, in response to your question about counter protesters, it was scary going to it because we didn't know, and when I feel like when I saw people writing their phone numbers and their lawyers' phone numbers on their arms in Sharpies, like, that's when it got really real for me, and we were afraid. But you go anyway. And there were counter protesters, but oh my goodness, there were barely any of them. There was like a dozen. And at the beginning, there were these speeches, by the speakers. Donna St. Croix spoke, a local pastor spoke, a representative from the Attorney General's office spoke, and a representative from one of the local political groups spoke. And there was one counter protester who was just heckling. And there were a lot of little old ladies from the community who had big signs. And the more he heckled, the closer they got to him
Mm.
until finally he shouted out. And there was a lot of tension. The police who were there started moving closer because they were getting too close. They were starting to like barricade in this man, these little old ladies with their signs. And so we were all just like holding our breath. And he shouted out, "I'm surrounded by fascism." And all these old ladies just cackled. And I think that was when the moment when all the fear broke. And we were like, oh my gosh, like we're not scared of anybody. Anybody who's opposed to children being in classrooms, we are not afraid. Um, and from that point on, it was just a beautiful morning and day of unity. And in a town of 1,300 people, over 1,000 people marched for the return of our
Wow.
students.
Right, and I think you told NPR, right, that sometimes you have to sort of laugh in the face of hatred.
Hmm.
Mm.
Absolutely. I think laughter is rebellious.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the students got released, right?
Mm-hmm. Our students were released, and I can say that, we're very delicate. We don't want to give any details about our students because it's just such a delicate balance. There's been a lot of critique of the school district that we somehow should have vetted our children, that we should have
What?
known, whatever, that, yeah, from people who are angry. But it's illegal in New York State. Like, they have the
Right.
right to be in school. It is
Yeah.
illegal to ask for someone's papers when they are registering for a public school. So it's just ignorance, and it comes from a place of ignorance, and it comes from a place of bias. So we don't give any information about our kids, and there's certain information we don't ask about our kids.
Mm-hmm.
But their return was life-changing. I mean, just seeing them walk down the halls. I have yelled at that third grader since then for running in the cafeteria. And what a privilege. Like,
Yeah.
I feel so moved by the normal, everyday instances of childhood that I get to witness.
Mm.
Yeah. I'm just curious, what is the response been from the community at large, upon the return?
I think our students were wonderful about it. Our neighbors were wonderful about it. The families were wonderful about it. But really, it's been very understated. We talked briefly with kids about, when you don't know what somebody's been through, you let them decide when they talk to you about it.
Mm.
And I think that's a really universal conversation that we have with kids all the time. If anything happens, if a kid's gone because they had their leg operated on, that's a conversation we have. So these are normal conversations that we're equipped for just as part of growing up. And we have let the kids kind of set the pace. In our community, I think we found that those haters on the internet were from farther away, whereas our neighbors were incredibly tolerant. And I hope that more people have that experience. Turn off the Facebook, go out in the streets, and even the people who disagree with you are far more decent than you ever would know from reading comments online.
And make sure you bring the old ladies to the protest, right?
Amen. I
And my
can't
God,
wait to see one.
and my God, I gotta ask, like, are you running for office anytime soon? Because Nora and I were talking about like this last 2 weeks has shown that I think men might be too emotional to lead. So, we got to try something different here. I don't know.
Oh, that's so funny. I was working with some teachers this morning, and we've ordered a new curriculum, and they are color coding everything, and they've created stickers and a whole system. And I'm just over and over again, I think teachers should run the world.
Yes.
It would be orderly. We would know, the lines would move at an effective pace. No red tape.
Yeah.
You would hopefully all get paid more too. But
Amen.
another
Say that louder for the
another
people in the
discussion for another day.
What do you hope that your own students have learned from this experience? I mean, they witnessed this in a way that I think not all students have been witnessing what's happening. I mean, at a
Mhm.
very close distance. What do you hope they learned from each other and from you?
The students who were taken and
No,
returned.
I mean just like the everyone in the school community.
Yeah. I'm going to answer you in two parts.
Okay.
The students who were taken and returned, I hope that they realize how loved they are. And I hope that any time that they are met with prejudice for the rest of their lives, they remember where they come from and that they are deeply known and deeply loved. And the students who witnessed this and participated in that rally and who wrote letters to their classmates and left them on their desk, or, who had the welcome home banner in the 3rd grade. I hope that they know in their bones what community means, and that community means that your voice adds to all the voices around you, and it is so powerful.
Mm.
And I hope they carry that with them always. I hope that they never discount the weight of their voice and their communities. They can
Yeah.
move mountains.
Yeah.
Yeah. With that being said, what happened in Sackett's Harbor, we don't want to stay in Sackett's Harbor. We'd love it if in some way there were other communities that replicated some of the bravery and intrepidness that was shown in this scenario. So I want to ask you, like, what do you think communities can learn from your own community? I mean, knowing that, yes, there are obviously nuances and differences, across this great land of ours. But that being said, right? I mean, there are things that definitely can travel and be duplicated.
The first and the easiest thing is that if you are a school district listening to this and somebody is taken from your school by ICE, I want you to personally call me and call our school. And I'm serious. There are so many people at our school who will give you the exact blueprint and every resource that we have, and you are not alone. Secondly, as you call out for help, we tend to think that things go viral person to person, but you really have to lean on your networks. So reach out to any union that you're a part of, reach out to the president of that union, reach out to any professional organizations, the president of that professional organization. And there are these huge circles of people, and they will magnify that call for help for you so that you're not by yourself. Thirdly, I would say, don't underestimate the power of your individual voice. The only reason we had success was because someone in power, high enough in power to make the call to send our children back to us, either felt enough pressure or enough conviction to make that call. It is so easy in our systems to feel like they are faceless, but they're not. They're all made up of people. And if you can move one person's mind in a conversation by the power of your heart and presence, you can change a system. You can change the rules. And I hope that gives them hope.
And yeah, and I think it's worth amplifying that what your community showed is possible has been demonstrated to be successful in a lot of other cases, right? That the pressure is working. It's unfortunately not working for everyone, but it is working. And it is a strategy that can be replicated and used in other places.
Absolutely.
Yeah, well, we know that unfortunately that we're gonna have to wrap up sooner than later, and so I do want to finish off with, at least with my last question, is that even though you seem to be extremely modest person, you did win an award for civic bravery from the Courage Project, and so I want to ask you, what does the term civic bravery mean to you, and how do other folks cultivate civic bravery?
Civic bravery means that you stand for your values publicly, even if you know the consequences may be equally public. And I think that's something people forget. Everyone wants to protest, but you can't shirk the consequences. You have to be willing to own those too. And that turmoil helps create change. So I think what people can do is they can get really clear about their values. I would say practice it in small ways. In your normal conversations, practice showing up with your authentic values publicly at the water cooler with your colleague who's making an off-color joke. We all know how it feels in our body when we're not true to our values. And I think that it is brave every single time you stay true to your values publicly. And then secondly, I would say a lot of people, especially if you live in a community like ours, it's 99.9% one way. You don't have a lot of opportunities to practice moral clarity on those issues. And so I would challenge you to give yourself the hypothetical. Think to yourself, if my neighbor disappears in the night tomorrow, what feels true to me and my values? How could I show up? Because it's going to be different for everyone. Some people are going to write letters. Some people are going to write poetry. Some people are going to show up in the streets. But just make sure that that answer that you give to yourself alone in your living room as you contemplate, carry that with you when it actually happens, even when you're scared. Because you will be. That's normal.
Yeah. Wow, I don't know if there's a better place to leave it than that. Nora, did you have anything else?
That was amazing. Thank you. Thank you for sharing this with us. And thank you for continuing to teach future generations about what civic bravery looks like as well. It's really powerful.
I'm really
Yeah.
grateful for the spotlight you guys are creating on this issue.
Mhm.
Well, we are grateful to you and all of your work, and we wish you continued luck. So.
Oh my gosh, what an extraordinary set of conversations. I feel so lucky that we've been able to host these today.
I think our listeners were spoiled by these two, I must say. I certainly felt spoiled. This was just an abundance of wisdom and inspiration, quite frankly. And as I had my 8 ounces of joy ready today. I'm throwing it out because I think both Jamie and Angelina, they gave us, a full 2 liter worth of like Mountain Dew of joy today, just in terms of the fact that, like, I'm normally a cynical person. That is my
Yeah.
default position. But, seeing the action and activity of folks, of everyday people, again, like within their communities, actually affecting change. And that this is why, I tell some of the students that I mentor that ultimately where we are going to find hope, where we're going to find joy, where we are going to find inspiration is in our local communities. And we certainly, that it was evidenced by today's interviews.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, gosh, I think that joy comes in the midst of such dark times, right? And so I think our ability to hold both of those, the
Yes.
opportunity of the moment as well as the incredible terror of this moment, it really came out in both of these interviews. So I hope we can hold those two things in balance this week.
Absolutely. And with that, let me read us out. Thank you to everybody for listening. Unlike some other podcasters, we will not tell you that we love you because, one, that is very creepy. We don't really know each other, but we will tell you to go love yourself, love your community, love the people around you at this very moment because they need it. And we thank you for listening. Also, if you have a moment at some point in this week, please do follow and share our podcast on YouTube, Blue Sky, as well as whatever podcast platform you listen to. Secondly, I just want to give a shout out to our producer, Jessica Partnow, and then also our wonderful music from Alham Aluo for our intro and outro music. Thank you so much for that, good sir. And with that, we will catch you in the meanwhile.